Hello, this is Elizabeth, and I am the Catholic Lady, and we're continuing with Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. Chapter 50, Part 3. The disciplined Romans loathed all mobs everywhere, for they threatened not only law and order, but civilization itself. The high priest had broadly hinted to the captain that if Saul died at the hands of the unruly, it might be regrettable, but it was only what he deserved. For did he not himself incite riots and incendiarisms wherever he journeyed? Had he not for many years ago brought Jerusalem almost to the edge of chaos? But the captain acted instinctively, and because of his years of discipline, the mob was now hurling Saul back and forth amongst themselves, and each time men struck him, but would not let him fall, and kept him flying between them on his feet, and beating him with fists and kicking him with their boots. The warm and darkening air of the Sabbath evening was alive with groans and grunts and thuds and imprecations, and tossing arms and heads and eyes that glowed like the eyes of animals in the dusk. And above it all roared the voice of the leader, hoarsely panting, "Kill him! Kill the blasphemer, the heretic, the enemy of Israel!" And he tried to get closer to Saul, to impale him with his dagger. It was then that the Roman acted, and his legionaries made a wedge and drove themselves into the mob, and the infuriated men spat upon them also, and tried to kick them, fearful that they would be deprived of their victim. But the Romans were stronger and trained, and they struck the men with the sides of their drawn swords, and their alien faces were terrible in the light of the torches. They hurled the would-be murderers of Saul to the ground, and kicked the side of their heads and trampled them, and used their shields as battering rams. Their polished helmets with the crest of horse's hair glittered in the torchlight, and their swords flashed, and they pressed like a phalanx toward Saul. Now the captain caught his arm as he was hurled backward to the waiting and eagerly grasping punishers, and held him upright, bleeding and fainting. Even his white hair was stained with blood, and his face was deathlike. The captain snapped manacles on his wrist and pushed him into the arms of two of his soldiers. Then he faced the snarling and hating and frustrated mob, contemptuously noting the savage eyes, the inhuman froth on wet lips, the heaving breasts, the beards on which lusting saliva was dripping. A sudden silence fell, and then it began to hum, as if giant bees had invaded the street. It was Roman law that a man must not be punished or executed without a hearing. So the Roman captain said with the cold anger, "What has this man done that you should set upon him?" A tumult as of hell broke loose then. The leader shrieked, "He is a blasphemer, a liar, a heretic, a destroyer of Israel." Others screamed other accusations. Grasping hands darted from sleeves towards Saul, who lay half fainting in the soldier's arms, as if to tear him limb from limb. The captain tried to sort out the howling accusations, and it was as if all the animals in the circus dens were yelling and shrieking and roaring simultaneously. He stood there, a young, sturdy man, bare legs far apart, hands, in the Italian manner, perched on his hips, his broad face cynical and harshly fierce. He tilted his head, his lips curled, and then he raised his mailed hand, and the noise diminished to the deep humming again. "Hearken to me," said the captain. "No mob, where I have jurisdiction, is going to slaughter any man, no matter who desires his death." And he raised his rough voice higher so that any lurking priest might hear, and thereafter scutter to their masters with the report. "I will take this man to the fortress Antonia, which is beside the temple, and there confine him for a just trial. As for you, if you riot again, you shall regret it, if you live." He motioned with his head to his men, who lifted Saul in their arms and began to carry him to the fortress Antonia, adjoining the temple. Other crowds had gathered curiously on the street, not Jews, but men of other races, And they watched the procession of the Roman soldiers, saw Saul carried high by 2 legionnaires, following the captain, and then the still infuriated mob, which was hardly chastened by the captain's threats. Yet they made no overt gesture, but cursed loudly between their teeth. Now a tawny moon was rising over the tiered city, and its light was golden on the stones and the walls. "Away with him!" the mob screamed. The soldiers reached the steps of Fortress Antonia, and Saul turned his bloody face to the captain and said in a weak voice, "I pray you that you have me set down, for I would speak to them." And he spoke in perfect Latin, and the captain stared at him, for he had been told that this man was an ignorant and unlettered peasant, a zealot from the dead hills of Galilee. The captain motioned to the soldiers, who set Saul on his feet on the steps of the fortress, above the heads of the crowds. And he said to Saul in his blunt voice, "Who are you? Is it possible I have heard of you wrongly, and so speak and tell me the truth?" Saul said, and his wonderful voice began to return, "I am a Jew of Tarsus, of Cilicia, no mean city, a citizen thereof, and a citizen of Rome. I beseech you, let me speak to the people." The captain stared incredulously, but Saul repeated, "I am indeed a citizen of Rome, and a Roman lawyer of the University of Tarsus." The captain had said abruptly to his men, "Put him down, but protect him." So they stood him on his feet, and he swayed dizzily for a moment, and a soldier caught his arm to steady him. He gathered all his strength and looked down at the heaving mobs in the red light of the torches, and he beckoned them like a father, that they might draw closer. Now he spoke in Hebrew with resonant emphasis. "Men, brethren, and fathers, hear my defense, which I will now make unto you. I am verily a man, who am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel." "Gamaliel, Gamaliel," shouted many men in astonishment, and they glanced at each other, for they had not known this, and their faces darkened, and they drew closer to Saul. "And taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous towards God, as all are here this day." "He lies," cried the leader, fearful that his victim, for whom he had already been paid, might escape and vengeance fall on himself. But the crowd was suddenly very quiet, for Saul's voice, as usual, commanded attention, and his words struck on their ears, and they were bewildered, for they had been told he was not only a blasphemer, but a malcontent, and a friend of the Romans, and an enemy of Israel. Now Saul's voice, ringing, soaring eloquent, narrated the story of his former prosecution of the Nazarenes out of zeal and error, and his journey to Damascus. The vast mass of men did not stir. All eyes were fixed upwards on that blood-stained face, and none saw the soldiers and their armor about Saul. They were entranced by the story, which they had not heard before. He told how the Lord had commanded him to leave Jerusalem after he had returned to the city. "While I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and I saw the Lord again, and he said to me, 'Make haste and get you quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me.' And I said, 'Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed in you. And when that blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting to his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him.' And he said unto me, 'Depart, for I will send you far hence unto the Gentiles.'" Saul paused. The crowd muttered and murmured uneasily, and looked into each other's eyes. Some were bewildered, and others baffled, still others incensed, and others lusted after a victim. The soldiers, not understanding, scolded at the men below, and shifted their iron-shod feet. Then the leader shouted, "You have heard his own testimony, that he persecuted his people and deserted them for the Gentiles, whom he has brought into the holy places for a scornful profanation. Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live." The crowd screamed and bent and lifted handfuls of dust into the air and flung them at Saul. Some tore their clothing in an excess of fury and renewed rage. The captain, in disgust at all this undisciplined passion, which reminded him of the motley mobs of Rome, curtly ordered Saul to be taken to the prison within the fortress. Then he sat, legs spraddled, while the still manacled man stood before him, the dried blood on his face and the eyes drooping in exhaustion. He narrowed his gaze disbelievingly on Saul. "I believe I will get the truth from you by scourging." And he waited for what Saul would say. Saul was still gasping, and he tried to steady himself, and he wiped his bleeding hands on the side of his long tunic. He looked at the wet gray walls of the inner side of the fortress, and the wet gray floor, and at the skeptical young captain who was eyeing him so sharply. The youth of Rome, and the gleam of his big bare knees, his broad unsubtle face, and bristling black hair, moved Saul by the reason of his youth, and he smiled, and he said with gentle reason, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned?" The captain narrowed his eyes again in what he evidently considered a very shrewd expression, and cynical. "What is a Roman citizen doing inciting the mobs to murder him? I have done nothing which you would understand, for it is unbelievable yet true. It is a doctrinal matter which would not interest you." "You Jews are always aflame with doctrinal matters," said the captain, "while the gods laugh. Well, are you a free-born Roman?" And he stood up and removed the manacles from Saul's wrist and tossed them with a clangor to the stone floor. "Had you spoken sooner, Paul of Tarsus, I should not have bound you, for it is unlawful to bind a Roman. This is no affair of mine, but only the affair of you Jews. I cannot release you for fear that your own people will murder you, so you will remain in the fortress tonight, and then you must appear before their own Sanhedrin. As a Roman, that is outrageous, but you are also a Jew. It is a delicate matter." He conducted Saul to a cell which was both dry and comfortable, for it was reserved for prisoners of distinction, and he ordered wine and meat and cheese and fruit for Saul, and clean blankets for his cot, and a lantern to light the darkness. "I trust you will understand my position," he said to Saul. "Yes, and I thank you," said Saul, and the captain, who would have been disciplined for maltreating a Roman citizen, smiled for the first time. That's the end of chapter 50.